Hello and welcome. I'm Belle Donati. I'm a news anchor and an arts presenter. It's lovely to see your names popping up as you join us from around the world. So thank you very much for being with us on this chilly, well, certainly in the UK, evening here. Now, I'm conscious that with restrictions around the world and lockdowns for many of us over the last year, life might have felt a little bit on hold, a little bit suspended. Well, I think this evening we're going to get an escape from that feeling with a life that we're going to discuss that was furiously animated, intense and unrelenting. The book is Francis Bacon, Revelations, and its authors are Annalyn Swan and Mark Stevens. They are a husband and wife partnership who won a Pulitzer Prize in 2005 for their biography of Willem de Kooning. In this detailed, I'm just going to hold it up so you can see it, this detailed, wonderfully readable biography of Francis Bacon. They examine an extraordinary life that tracks an extraordinary century. Annalyn Swan and Mark Stevens, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, our viewers will have noticed that you're on separate screens, lest anyone thinks that Francis Bacon, spending 10 years with Francis Bacon, might have driven you apart. I just want to make it very clear that you're in separate rooms because it's much easier for us technically. Now, I want to start with an amusing anecdote from towards the end of the book. It goes like this. Michael Pepiat, a friend of Francis Bacon, wanted to write a biography. Bacon remarked that it would take a Proust. Is that how you felt? Has this been your à la recherche du temps perdu? Let's start with you, Annalyn.
Bacon, of course, was prone to exaggeration. That was one of his exaggerated, dramatic statements because he, believed in performance and was such a swaggering performer. Mostly that statement was about Bacon attempting to shoo people away from his life. He never wanted to be pinned down. He knew that behind the performance, there was so much hidden. So that was camouflage more than anything else. Having said that, he was a marvelous reader and did read Proust, read Proust in the original in French. So bravo to him.
What about for you too? I mean, 10 years is a long time to spend with anyone, let alone a character like Francis Bacon. Mark, what sort of effect has that had on you?
Well, people always want to know why we're not divorced, really. They think if you spend so much time together building a house, people say you'll always get divorced. And if you build a book, it takes longer to build a book than a house. How can you possibly not be divorced? I think that's always the subtext of that particular question. And then if the subject is Bacon, who's not always so cheery anyway, But in fact, I think these big research biographies, it's wonderful to have a companion because.
Is it normal for you to spend 10 years with a character like this? And I'm sorry for those of you who are noticing I'm moving around. I've just worked out that my plug socket is not working, so I'm finding another one, but I am still here. So Mark, please just tell me, is it normal for you to spend 10 years with one of these?
No, it's utterly abnormal. The problem is that I'm very lazy and Annalyn does most of the work. So it takes 10 years, but it really, I think the good thing about taking so long is that you can go back to people, you become friends with people, and you get to know the material in a more intimate, unrushed way. And I think that has a great impact on the final book.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, and I guess it also allows you the time to let these stories settle with you and to live them, to feel them before you start committing to the page, which is another part of your work that I'm fascinated by. You split the work between you entirely. I always assumed that one of you might be focusing on the research and one of you on the writing, because this book hangs together. It's written as though with one voice. How do you do that in practice? I mean, one of you surely is typing the words. How does it work?
Well, we type the words. Oh, sorry.
Mark, let's start with you and then we'll come to Annalyn.
Well, I was going to say we both do everything, and I think the trick with lots of writing is to revise and try to get it better. And if you spend a long time on a project, you begin to, I think you can deepen your understanding of it. And so you then must revise and revise and revise. Really, you could go on forever.
Annalyn, what would you say?
I would say another aspect of this is all the travels that we undertook to add to the length of time of the book. The the first and last, the 3 biographies of Francis Bacon that came out right after his death in the 1990s, no one ever really did what we say boots on the ground research. And so it wasn't a hardship by any means, but we knew that we had to go in and cover the Anglo-Irish aspect of Bacon's background, which was so very, very important to him. And that involved, of course, visits and spending time in the so-called big house culture. We did the same in Tangier. We did the same in the south of France. We did the same in Spain and France, So that when you do such a thorough, I want to see everything, I want to peel it back, kind of investigative reporting for a book of this size, that also takes a lot of time. But to Mark's point, we both of us, we really do. It's mulched all together. We report and write sort of different sections to begin with, but finally everything goes through the mixer endlessly to get that seamless voice.
Mark, did you have something to add to that?
Well, I was going to say, I think the interesting thing is that we agree that in a biography, you don't want the words to be all about the writers, the biographers. They need to have personality, but you need to be able to look through the words to the subject as well. So that's a tricky equation to have, for the writing to have personality, that it represents us, but also for you to be able not to be distracted by the biographer all the time, what the biographer is thinking. You want the object in view. And I think we agree pretty much on what those proportions should be. And that makes it easier, or at least the arguments less intense.
Yeah, and it certainly reads in that way. There are so much of what you're reading is through other people. You're hearing quotations from other people, and the panoply of people you spoke to, it's enormous. The voices in there are myriad. But as you said, Anne-Lynne, unlike those biographers, and those were Michael Pepiat, Daniel Farson, David Sylvester, those sort of initial biographers who knew Bacon personally, often very, very well, you obviously don't. How important did you feel it was for a biography to be written at this remove from Bacon, both obviously a distance of time, but also a distance of relationship? Let's start with you, Anne-Lynne.
Well, there is a certain obvious advantage to being a writer, knowing your subject. So we had the benefit of, in effect, of 2 worlds. The first world was the people who knew Bacon, Michael Pepiat and Dan Farson. So they wrote from their perceptions, they knew him in very different ways and different people. But then we had the license to come to Bacon fresh, as it were, to see him in the context not only of the 20th century, but in the beginnings of the 21st. So in a way, I would argue that, and I'll be curious to hear what Mark says, but I would argue that it's kind of an advantage in a sense that you don't have to take on this Bacon. How would you see beyond the person you'd had dinner with? How would you see what he was hiding? And in this case, he was hiding a great deal. So it does work to our advantage as well. With having said that, we have the access to the people who did know him through the hundreds of interviews, as well as the writers of earlier biographies.
Mark, how much did you feel those earlier biographies were, I guess, predecessors, and how much did you lean on them?
I think we lent on them a great deal, especially in the Pepiat biography, because he had original material that Bacon reported about his early years and at certain periods of his life. But I think we drew some different conclusions, perhaps, than Pepiat did about that material. So we were using it almost as an original resource, and then juxtaposing it and making it in 3 dimensions with lots of other material. One of the things we had to do was check on Bacon again and again and again, because he had this very developed public persona, very dramatic, lovely, exciting, and a very important part of his life and his world. But we looked behind that as well. And that took not only a lot of time, but it was part of the fascination of the book, because the man was paradoxical. He had contrary leanings. He could do 2 things at once. And so we tried to bring all of this together. And I think we also, I mean, Anne-Lynne can speak to this too, but we can, if you're doing a book like this, it's almost like a 19th century novel, and you You can have lots of secondary characters and make them important. You can draw back and talk about the social period. You can draw in close to the characters. You can change your focal length. So the book has that kind of quality, which a memoir probably doesn't. Annalyn, do you agree, or?
Yes, and I teach biography and memoir writing, and the first class that we began by reading excerpts from an essay written by Leon Edel, the great biography of Henry James, and I will interpolate that our book is called A Thunker. He wrote a 5-volume biography of Henry James, but be that as it may, the main point that Leon Edel makes that I impress upon my students is, he says, show, don't tell. And by that, that's picking up on what Mark was saying. What you want to do is let the story almost tell itself. You try to narrate through anecdotes. You try to go behind the mask, with sort of some of the revealing things that you find. But narrative in a biography is essential. Leon Edel also said novelists and poets should write biography. You don't want just a chronology based on facts, and you go to the next chapter and it's another year. What we try is the exact opposite of that.
Yes, you need a narrative line, not just a bag of facts or an attic or this massive mountain you're climbing with a bag of sand on your back, which is what a lot of very large biographies feel like. You need a portrait, and you have to have that almost. It's quite musical, really, isn't it? I mean, two people will play a Chopin prelude. One of them, they're both technically perfect, but one of them it's wonderful and the other it's not. And it's because of that line, which is a mysterious kind of thing, a narrative line.
You say musical, I felt almost sculptural. I felt there was this shaping of, as you say, a mass of events, a mass of things that happened, and actually shaping into all of these events into something that not only is chronological, but also takes a shape. It creates a meaning, which we'll come to, because obviously once we get into those events. Obviously the two of you are American. Francis Bacon was British. How important was it for you to place Bacon's work in an international context in this book?
Which of us do you want us to?
I'm so sorry. I'll start with Mark.
No. I mean, you want me to? I mean, I think it's both useful and not useful to be an American in relation to Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon, of course, was not purely English. He was an Anglo-Irish person, and that is a very specific kind of plant, a very potted plant, really. And so, he's an edgy, marginal person to begin with. And so it's not altogether bad to be from another context. But yes, I mean, I think Annalyn would agree. We don't have that visceral same. We've been in England a lot. We were graduate students there, but we don't have that same visceral understanding that a native person would, and that's a loss, no doubt. I think, but it has its advantages also.
I guess being able to see things from a remove is certainly an advantage. The book is obviously called Revelations. It is a monumental task to try to find truly new information about an artist who's not only been written about so much, but who has spoken himself about his work. There also seems to be a little bit of a biblical allusion in Revelations. Annalyn, can you talk a little bit about how you decided upon that title?
Yes, because the more we got in, the deeper we went into the Francis Bacon project, as it were, the more we realized the extreme disconnect between how Bacon had presented himself throughout the years of his life. So we began sort of trying, really a lot of the book, a lot of the research and the thinking was to try to get, behind the mask, but, behind the facade. And the revelations, people often think of revelations. Mark always jokes that, one revelation might be that Francis Bacon loved golf and spent every weekend golfing.
We hoped we would find that he was a heterosexual with a hidden wife in Essex, but we didn't.
But none of the above. But when you actually look at how we reinterpreted the life, the revelations, I believe one reviewer put it very well, sort of said, the revelations are cumulative. There's not a great big thunderbolt of a revelation like the wife in Sussex. But it was the interpretation of trying to go behind the mask that he so valiantly and dramatically kept in place throughout his life. One of the great revelations was how very difficult it was for him. You know, Mark alluded to this earlier, but Bacon's performance, he was really very, very shy and introverted given his background, you know, a young asthmatic child, never had boys who were friends of his in Ireland. He was dealt a very bad hand. But he, by force of sheer persistence and personality, he managed to create this great creation of Francis Bacon. But behind that facade, it was sort of held together with baling wire, you know, and sticky tape, because it was all a performance that he could not pull off without alcohol and massive amounts of drugs, which have only sort of become known recently through his doctor, Dr. Paul Brass. So, you know, when he was comfortable, he could dominate a room easily. He was the life of the party. He always knew he was the most important person in the room. But there were many, many instances where he was truly, you know, anxious about going out. One really very kind of sad note was Jose Capello towards the end. We interviewed friends of Jose Capello because we wanted to, you know, clarify the end and take the narrative up to his death in Madrid. And Jose Capello talked about how Bacon would be so nervous about going to a dinner party with intellectuals who, of course, had all gone to Oxbridge, and he hadn't, that he would write notes for himself about what questions he might ask. So that is a very revealing detail about the great Francis Bacon swaggering across the stage of life. The swagger was there, but so was the, you know, the effort it took.
It was an almost sort of Wildean, and you make that allusion to Oscar Wilde a lot in the book, this sense of masking and hiding. And of course, there was the other comparison between those two men is that they were homosexual in a time where homosexuality was still illegal for a lot of Francis Bacon's life. There are these secret lives and these, yes, masks that he hides behind. Mask making was something he obviously became very familiar with from a very early age, either from looking around him or from personal experience. We have this view of him, the hard drinker, the submissive lover in often abusive relationships, and also this idea of the natural genius who didn't have to work very hard. You obviously dive behind that. Mark, one of the revelations there is that he was actually much more sentimental in love, in those sexual relationships, than has previously been suggested, wasn't he?
Yes, and revelations, I mean, it means many different things in the book, but one of them is that Bacon loved that explosive moment of revelation when the truth comes out from behind the closet or the shadow or the shade. And that can be sexual, of course, and that's what people have concentrated on. He opens up the closet door sexually, but he also did it metaphysically in lots of ways. You know, he was taking away everything that people depend upon to give them comfort in life often, and flinging that way and saying, actually, the truth is different. Now, this is a very powerful thing to do, but Bacon also felt the loss of these things, and he understood weakness really, really well. So when you got your questions about love, really, about his love relationships, like lots of clever people, he put love in scare quotes, you know. He wasn't going to be made vulnerable by love. And he was quite proud of that. And he always talked about, oh my God, it was just dreadful, you know, this awful relationship, blah, blah, blah. In fact, he, I mean, he was an alley cat sometimes for sure, but he also would he had consistent long-term relationships that he did not want to ever abandon. And he was absolutely and totally and embarrassingly, because embarrassment and shame enter in here, he was in love with Peter Lacy in this very, very powerful way. That made him vulnerable and weak. And so, yes, that's he understood the power of flinging open the door, but he also understood the weakness of being exposed. And he felt exposed in love, I think, and he was regularly exposed. Peter Lacy was probably his first and best and greatest love, but then he had a success of other men he also loved over a very long period of time.
Yeah, and there are these extraordinarily tender moments of selfless acts that he makes towards his lovers, which are not within the sort of myth of Francis Bacon, this quite self-important, self-fulfilled person. Annelyn, one of the other apocryphal tales around Francis Bacon's childhood, and I'm now moving us back to Ireland here, is that he was beaten by his father's groomsmen. Another myth, if you like, suggests that his father, who was a major, who was quite proper, found him dressed in his mother's clothes and was horrified by this. Now, the way you treat these two episodes, you use the conditional tense in one of them. It really highlighted to me the difficulty in trying to separate fact from mythology around Francis Bacon. Would you agree with that? Was there, I mean, for these particular episodes, did you come to a conclusion on what happened?
Well, in the incidents of the wearing his mother's underwear, we put it, as you rightly said, in the conditional, because no one finally is going to know. You know, Bacon did obfuscate, he embellished in his later storytelling. So we tried to tell what we knew. And in this case, Ianthe, his sister Ianthe Knott, was extremely helpful in certain respects. The biggest revelation from her, I think it would be fair to say, is that she said that Francis Bacon was never tossed out of the house, that she would have known, you know, she was 10 years younger, she would have known the family record on these events. And she said, well, you know, in her wonderful sort of Mockney accent, you know, she said, well, you know, a lot of what Francis said was, you know, rather wrong. And so she was a wonderful kind of guide and yardstick to trying to get to the truth of his past. The other interesting thing that we discovered in Ireland, and he never, of course, addressed, is all of the sort of familial girlfriends, in the sense of friends who were girls, that he had. He may not, it is true, had many friends who were boys, but he did have friends who were girls. And for example, the summer that he was allegedly roundly tossed out of the house by the major, we found a picture of him with the prior Wansford family. There he is with them, the dog. It's a cozy environment. He looks exactly like sort of a happy teenager, you know, 16 at the time. So what do you make of all this? He also said later in life that the grooms beat him, but then he also said the grooms didn't beat him. He said he had sex with the grooms. He told David Plant, the novelist, the writer who was a friend of his, no, well, his first sexual encounter was Berlin. So finally, I think the conditional is the way to go. And then you try to use your best judgment.
Can I add something there, which is that a lot of the stories around Bacon have this myth-like quality, as if they've been honed. And what that means is not that they're wrong. They might be, all the facts might not line up. They might not be entirely correct factually, or it might be uncertain what the facts are. But the myth has its own kind of truth. So that when Bacon says that he was thrown out, he might not have been literally thrown out, but he felt thrown out. And I think he organized his feeling of truth around that. He was much more interested in that kind of truth than he was in literal fact. So the facts, you know, the facts can be their own kind of closet, can't they? And you can fling away the fact in order to show the truth that's hiding within the fact somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I hadn't thought about it like that. That's very, very true. There is, I mean, interestingly, we talk about these myths, this idea between this link between mythology, between facts, and obviously there's this huge influence on Bacon from Greek tragedy, from Greek drama as well. I want to talk about the Greek dramatist Aeschylus. You write in your book, Bacon could dream of becoming an artist like Aeschylus, a mentor who was all the greater for representing a tradition of one. Now, this particular version of Aeschylus was, you say, from the Irish scholar W.B. Stanford's text on him. How big an influence was this, and where do we see it within not only his work but within his life? Let's start there with you, Mark.
Aeschylus, I'm no expert in Greek drama, but Stanford's point in this book, this slim book, which by the way is a marvelous book and well worth reading, it should be brought out again. His point was really to emphasize the rough-hewn, self-taught, unpolished genius of Aeschylus, as compared to, say, Sophocles, who was much more fluent and much more Tea Party-like, despite the fact of the tragedies and all that. But so for Bacon, especially in 1944, when he was reading this, or the early 40s, to be told that he didn't have to have gone to school, to be told that you can invent yourself, that you can be a genius of one, was liberating for him. Freeing.
Yes, for a boy, of course, who we must say had not been formally educated. Well, I mean, he'd had 1 year of formal education, which hadn't really worked out. So this is for him. I mean, I wonder, because I see as well when you talk about the triptychs that we see in Bacon's work later on. Well, of course, Aeschylus was the pioneer of the trilogy within Greek drama. So I wonder if there's this echo that kind of goes along the years. Do you see that at all?
Anwen, do you want to do that one? Or, I mean, yes, there is. I mean, he does, plays are 3 acts often, you know. He likes to have 3 pictures in which a discrete event is happening. They're connected, but they're also separate. But yes, there is an echo in his work constantly about the Greeks. And of course, the Greeks, the ancient Greeks and ancient culture generally, including the Egyptians, they were before Christendom. They were before the Western construct. So like Nietzsche, Bacon was going back to something that he thought was more vigorous and more true than the overlay that Christianity, that sort of piety and that softness that Christianity brought to Western culture. Bacon approved of that sacrificial, ferocious, look it in the face kind of truth that the Greeks had in their tragedies.
And of course, sorry, Anne, you go ahead.
There's one other thing too, which is I think that all the tragedians were very important to him, because remember, Francis Bacon only had a little less than 2 years of proper schooling. But early on in his life, before that, as a sort of preteen, he had a tutor named Lionel Fletcher, a parson, when he was living at Strafford Lodge in County Kilkenny. And so what the Grey Gowrie, of course, the arts minister, Grey Gowrie's, that was his great uncle, and he explained to us what these parsons were like. And basically those parsons, even though, you know, they were Christians and all about the Bible, but the reading was classical. So we sense that during the period when he was being tutored, he began his reading with Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And that would also naturally lead to his interest later in Stanford. And so there was this element of the Greeks and tragedy from an early age. And can you imagine a boy on the outside, sort of a little bit looking in, the shy, asthmatic boy? What a revelation that would have been to him at that very early age to start reading the Greek playwrights.
But also, you know, another thing that Stanford did is by emphasizing the untutored quality of Aeschylus and the mistakes Aeschylus, you know, the kind of unartful, vulgar, untrained stuff that he did as opposed to the other Greek dramatists, by emphasizing that that's okay. In fact, that can even be better. Bacon, who is untrained, you know, he has an untutored quality himself, and he often makes sort of mistakes that are better than unmistakes when he makes art, because he's having to invent it from nothing, you know.
I wonder if that's later in life why he feels confident enough once he's made it to say, oh, I can't draw, I can't do this, like, you know, I'm no draftsman, essentially. You know, that is pointing to his unschooled, untutored background. Do you think that might have given them the confidence, this shy boy, to do that, Mark?
Yes, yes. Yes, I think that the idea that you could become a serious artist without having gone to school, just because of something inside yourself, that you could assert power and weakness at the same time, the way the Greeks do, reveal that tension of absolute power and absolute weakness, which, by the way, is also a 20th century social, I mean, very important in our social and cultural history, totalitarianism, wars, etc., like that, to get to that Greek power and weakness thing without having to have learned Latin. You know, he didn't know Greek or Latin. I think was immensely reassuring and helpful.
I want to move on to the sort of the next period of his life, in his late 20s, early 30s. You write in some detail about a period that until now hasn't really been dealt with. This is when he was an interior designer, a furniture designer. He was making modernist designs that sort of rehashed French and Bauhaus pieces at the time. It wasn't that original, I guess, for the French, for the Continentals, but it was very different in the UK. And he was pretty good at it. In another age, another world, could we have been talking, Annelyn, about Francis Bacon, the designer?
Well, that's an interesting question that you brought up, because Madge Garland, who was, you know, a great force in the design and fashion worlds of the time, both in London and in Paris, later wrote a book called The Indecisive Decade about the 1930s. And she brought up in her book Francis Bacon, who had a mere blip of time in his decorated career versus when he started to become a painter. But she highly praised his aesthetic. She wrote a story about him in the Studio magazine, the 1930s Look and Decoration. And with her backing, she would have been all prepared to help him become a major designer, as would Arundel Clark, who was also another major name of the period, along with Norman Hartnell. I mean, these people were sort of at the top of their game back when Francis Bacon was doing his design work. But at the point that there was almost like a fork in the road in Bacon's life. He had been painting already in 1929 when he made a trip to Ireland. We know he was painting. He always said, oh, I didn't paint anything, this little dibs and dobs until 1943. You know, he sprang out of the head of Apollo. Apollo? No.
Zeus.
Zeus, right. But so you know, clearly the young Francis made a decision that he was going to leave behind a career that he was actually quite good at and had been remarkably successful for somebody his age. And he had major backers. And he walked away from that because, you know, as Mark said earlier, he had this vision of what Picasso could be when he was in France. And that sort of parting of the ways, the road that he took was very, very hard compared to his design world. He was already in that world, he had connections, and instead, in the early 30s, he chose to start all over again, paint madly, and that is one of the sort of revelations, as it were, of our book, which is exactly how hard Francis Bacon worked as a painter before he ever had any kind of public success.
Absolutely, I want to come on to that. It's Mark, it's really interesting that once he'd had his success, he completely denied, hid, however you want to put it, this previous career. Why do you think he was so keen to hide that design career once he'd made it as a painter? Well,
many artists are a little embarrassed about the commercial work they do early on, but I think it's that he, again, if you think about this dynamic between power and weakness, it seems much more powerful to suddenly emerge to be a wastrel and a wonderful kind of person wasting his youth. That's very romantic, really, isn't it? And then suddenly become a great genius. That's much more romantic and much more powerful as an image than the truth, which is that he was a committed and determined and ambitious designer for a couple of years, who was very good at making connections and developing mentors. And then he took, as Annelyn said, this very, very difficult and lonely road as an artist. But even there, he showed in the best modern gallery of the time. He was working, it seems, very, very regularly and very, very hard, often all night. He was ambitious from the get-go. You know, he was not this person. Of course, he played at night. Of course, he had these escapades. But he was also, as Annelyn said, a very, very determined, ambitious, and hard worker. Ambitious, but not in the first instance successful as a painter, and yet so persistent, because despite this, he continued trying to find that way that he was going to paint his figure. He didn't know exactly how it was going to be, and he would come to Picasso and then disappear from Picasso. And interestingly, in a time in British art where other British artists were turning inward, they were turning towards the domestic, he looked to the continent. He looked to Berlin, he went to Paris, he looked to Picasso. He was an outlier in that sense. How do you square that shy 10-year-old boy with this extremely persistent and brave artist later on, even though failing, continuing at what he believes was right? Well, he was both powerful and weak, as I was saying. He had an extraordinary inner sense of what the world was. And the revelation for him was that he could do something about it in art. He could explain that, he could address it, he could confront it. And one of the revelations of the book is that in the 30s, most of the work that survives from that period is quite tasteful French modernist kind of art. But really, he was mostly painting, it seems, very, very difficult pictures that are as difficult as the ones that later appeared. He rented and created a gallery all on his own called Transition. He showed some of that work. It was a complete failure. Nobody noticed. Nobody paid attention. But he knew, he had an inner drive and compulsion. He knew that he had something to reveal, I think. And that was very powerful. However shy the asthmatic boy was, he had quite an engine in there.
And he was really a product as well of the 20th century. I mean, you write that he acknowledged in his late interviews that his art was indeed forcefully shaped by the century in which he grew up, and that Nietzsche and the existentialists helped him face the truth of the world. He says, Bacon, this is, during my childhood, I lived through the revolutionary Irish movement, Sinn Féin, the wars, Hiroshima, Hitler, the death camps, and the daily violence that I've experienced in my life. I want to go now to one of the paintings, his breakthrough painting, the 3 studies for figures at a base of a crucifixion. This is 1944, and I do believe we have a slide to show you of that painting. And Mark, I just want to ask you, with this triptych that we're seeing now, how important World War II was, certainly, because you place that within your book as a turning point for Bacon. He goes from being an artist who is really failing at finding his idiom, his painting idiom, to an artist who is confident and absolutely certain of what he is doing. Was he lucky that World War II came along in this, or is it that the world suddenly was able, because the world was plunged back into war, the world was suddenly ready to accept these difficult images that we see before us?
Well, I think the war created an echo in him that said that he was right all along in the 30s, that his point of view could be justified. But if you look at that painting, the first thing you see is this kind of vile orange. And if you think of what London was like in 1944 and 45, there was no color to be found. It was all dust and rubble. And you would never bring that orange into your drawing room. Where does that orange come from? Well, possibly, where would orange be? It would be in fires, bombs. If you look at what the residue of the war is there, and with the orange, you see a little patch of grass, a little bit of a table. There's not much left of the world. It's all gone this frightening orange.
Absolutely. And just tell us the reception of this painting, because this was his breakthrough work. He was suddenly noticed. How did that come about? Just talk to us about that moment.
Annalyn, do you want to do that?
Yeah, well, yes. And then I want to talk a little bit about Steep and where this painting came from. Or maybe, may I back up for just a minute?
More to say about the painting too. I mean, but
Right. But I just wanted to mention that during the war, Bacon had to retreat from London, and he stayed in this tiny town of Steep in Petersfield. And it was there that he first began exploring imagery, sort of savage imagery, like 3 Studies. And so it's 3 Studies is a sort of extenuation, culmination of this series that he began there. And he was looking at pictures of Nazi leaders, and painting one, a sort of Nazi in a cap, and sort of colonnades on fire. So this was all in his imagination. And then it was promoted to the center of his imagination. It came to the fore during the war. But the reception that this painting got is kind of unimaginable, because it was part of a show at the Lefebvre Gallery, and the headline painter was Graham Sutherland, and the other one was Henry Moore, and then assorted other luminaries. And as John Russell wrote in this marvelous book, love the John Russell biography of Francis Bacon, he wrote about the crowds who came into this gallery feeling that, we were now going to, England was righting itself, the war was over, life was going to go on, we're going to put all this to the past. And instead, they came in wanting reassurance, and they left reeling, having seen these sort of grotesque monsters nothing about the monsters reflected their desire to get back to normal. You know, everybody was desperate to return to normal life, and here they were being forced to confront the worst in mankind.
Well, and if you notice, there are no eyes in the painting. It's all just mouth, which is for masticating and for screaming. But the most disturbing image is the center one, because of the bandage and the way it's sort of half smiling, looking at you. It's confiding and intimate. What it's saying, these monsters, is not what the English wanted after the war, which was to say, well, the Nazis were bad. It was all, the beast is in Germany. The beast is in the Nazis. What this painting is saying, sorry, the beast is in ourselves. And it doesn't allow you that reassurance that people wanted. I mean, when Henry Moore did his war drawings of the subways, of the underground, there was a kind of, it was sad, but you have a feeling that these people are going to emerge like hobbits from the underground, and they'll take over and populate England again. This is nothing like that. This says that the problem is in us. And they're very good monsters, by the way, right? I mean, you can't forget them once you've seen them. It's not so easy to make a good monster.
It certainly isn't. And those mouths, of course, become the image that we see recurring through Bacon's work for decades afterwards. Annelyn, I want to move us slightly to another of the revelations in your book, which is, again, something that hasn't had airtime before. It's the deep relationships that Bacon had with particularly strong women. I'm talking about his maternal grandmother, Granny Supple, Isabel Rawsthorne, Muriel Belcher, Nadine Hayme. They often get lost, or they have previously got lost in this sort of Soho macho environment. Can you just talk to us a little bit more about those relationships and how important they were?
Absolutely. And it's, again, you're absolutely right. It's the side of Bacon that just kind of got pushed out of the sacred monster myth. But imagine all the way back, as we were talking about the asthmatic boy, friends who were boys in Ireland, but he does have this wonderful figure, Granny Supple, who is the life of every party. She had tons of money. She bought houses, as big houses, as we said, like other ladies would buy hats. You know, she was a character on the stage. And she took him up as a young boy and began to sort of take him around to the sort of county parties and events. And he always made fun of himself by saying, oh, you know, I was just so terrible. I stood in a corner and was so shy. But as we point out in the book, Granny Supple would not have dragged along some inarticulate, bumptious lad, you know. So that was the beginning of Francis Bacon gravitating to strong women. He did exactly the same thing in France. My particular favorite, I guess, is Isabel Rawsthorne, who he met during the years when he was down working primarily in the south of France. And of course, Isabel Rawsthorne was a larger than life character in every single way. Here she is, Bacon having painted her in Soho as a sort of commanding presence. You can almost imagine her as a duchess, looking at her subjects and, you know, regally acknowledging their glances towards her. She was a figure of real significance, both in his life and in Soho in general. In the 1949, 50, 51 period, she, in effect, got him through some really tough moments. They had a lot of correspondence back and forth. They saw each other a great deal. She was one of those women who really helped promote him, and he would talk to her in a way he didn't to male artists with whom he might be competitive. And they would discuss things like figure and ground and what kind of frame should be put on the paintings and, you know, what have you. So she held a very special role in his life, as of course did Muriel Belcher, the queen among the queens, as we wrote at the Colony Room. And so you wouldn't want to be a timid, halting woman to get into Francis Bacon's graces. But the dames he liked, the Sonia Orwells, the Isabel Rawsthornes, Anne Dunn, Madge Garland early on, they were special. And if you look at the correspondence between Bacon and all of these different women, you see that it was a very important part of his life. And you know, they held parties. He loved to go to them. He would feel comfortable. And all of that somehow got washed out in the earlier tellings of his life.
The homosexual macho Soho scene obviously took over from that. And within that scene that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, the running from the money problems, the stress of this life that Bacon was hanging onto by a thread, keeping all these masks in place, you know, on this roller coaster of the highs and lows of gambling, even into his 40s, he was still asking for handouts from friends and sort of moving between sort of lovers, family, everyone. Complicated relationships that he was juggling, complicated emotions. He also, this stress that perhaps we can see within his painting, had a real problem with deadlines. So whenever there was a show coming up, he would escape to the sun for a while, and then you tell the story of him every time thinking, I can't do this over here, I'm out in the south of France or Tangier, and he'd have to come back to London, and actually that's where he'd get the work done. Without those shows, those deadlines, would we have had as much work? And also, is it a sign of this stressful experience, this stressful life, that stops him from being able to just stop and put paint to canvas? Mark?
Yes, the deadline was very important to him. It was a kind of hanging, as Dr. Johnson said, for him. I mean, he needed that tension and anxiety and that sense that he's going to bet all his money on one number in roulette and he's going to win. That's the feeling that he needed to work. And the other way he worked is that he depended upon chance and miracles happening on the canvas. That's what he wanted to see happen. And if you squeeze that into a very narrow frame, the intensity is intoxicating. And that's what he would do. It resulted in probably a lot of bad paintings getting out. I mean, one of the things about Bacon that you should also say is that there's good and bad. There are less good paintings. If you take his 40 or 50 best paintings, they're extraordinary. But if you take them all, many are not. Many are repetitive, you know, and branding exercises. That comes also from, gosh, I didn't hit in roulette today in the studio. I didn't make that. And he destroyed endless amounts of his work. He really didn't care. It was all, I mean, it was all about the miracle in the moment for him. And if it didn't happen, cut it up. Or try to make a miracle happen over here. And if something worked on the other part of the canvas, so what if you destroy the whole thing? He really had a gambler's view of art, and he didn't care.
Yeah, it's interesting that you write, you know, he was an erratic painter. Obviously, the amount that he destroyed meant that a lot of what he deemed not good enough was destroyed, but there is some still out there. I want to just bring in another book that is out about Francis Bacon that AnnaLynne, you mentioned that you'd read. This is the Max Porter book. It's nothing like a biography. It's a sort of poetic fragment along the lines of the painting. But in an interview, I heard Max Porter saying that there's a lot of repetition in Bacon's work. Now, you in your book say something slightly different. You say that in his earlier work, Bacon was a vivid modernist who stripped the Western mask to reveal a difficult interior truth. Later, he more closely resembled a postmodernist who found masks behind those masks. Can you just talk, AnnaLynne, a little bit about how that shift in his work, Mark was alluding to it then, this sort of the branding that we see perhaps in his later work, how that shift took place? And if you'd like to mention the Max Porter, what you thought of that Max Porter, that'd be wonderful as well.
Yes, indeed. Well, there's a critical opinion that Bacon's later work was too polished. You know, he went from the sort of those miracle works of the late 40s, the Head One, the creatures, and the businessmen in their Stygian gloom, and you know, every single one of those paintings or of the animals that he did during that time, they were so compelling, so first rate. But they were also, as Mark was saying, a tremendous struggle, and many of them were destroyed. Over time, when Bacon became more fluent as a painter and sort of mastered the techniques, then he started turning out, after 1962, these big triptychs, and that were grand and wonderful to look at. But they also became exercises in sort of a more polished presentation. I guess that would be the fair thing to say. Other artists in particular, if you talk to them, a lot of them, virtually all of them admired the early Bacon, but the later ones, they say, oh, well, you know, he just sort of focused on this figure, but then the background was sort of elegantly sprayed on, and everything had become so much easier. Lucian Freud, who of course was one of Bacon's great friends until their famous falling out, you know, he talked about what he thought as a very sad move in Bacon's painting away from that, you know, the wonderful wrestling with demons that was marked all the earlier paintings into this sort of later grand theatrical. The best of those late paintings were almost Greek tragedies on canvas, you know, like the big 1976 triptych he did. But there was a lot of downside. But then towards the end of his life, and I think this is what was so compelling for Max Porter, you know, Bacon became a very haunted man. He had always flourished, and, you know, he was the vigorous man, the power in the room, and that power began to diminish. His health began to decline. It was no longer so easy for him to have amorous encounters. He became, you know, lonely, and with his sort of imprisoned at Riis Mews with his oxygen canisters. And so at the very end of his life, when he winds up in Spain, having got on a plane against his doctor's orders, you will die, Francis, if you get on the plane and go to Spain, he went regardless. So he arrived there and had made the choice that he was going to die in Madrid, we think, rather than die in his at Riis Mews, imprisoned, you know, with the oxygen canisters. So the end of his life was both poetic and sad. And what I think Max Porter did so brilliantly is use the scene of Francis being alone in a hospital bed at the Clínica Ruber in Madrid. And through his mind is sort of this stream of consciousness, somewhat hallucinogenic views of life. It's melding the art together, the people from his past together. And it's really quite a lovely and poetic way of explaining a lot of what Francis Bacon did in his life from the perspective of his death.
And trying very much to verbalize painterly movements, painterly gestures, which is, yeah, as you say, incredibly beautiful.
And interpolated with that also, though, the fact of talking to the sister, you know, who was there taking care of him. So it has both an immediacy, and then it will go off into the sort of visionary. Is Francis Bacon lucid? It's just lovely, a sort of prose poem.
And yeah, exactly, feels very appropriate as well for his work. Mark, I want to bring in another triptych. We've seen sort of that breakthrough triptych. I want to bring in now the painting, the triptych, August of 1972. This is one of the four great triptychs that Bacon painted after the death of George Dyer, his lover, in Paris. Now, of course, George Dyer died the night before his Bacon's retrospective, which opened at the Grand Palais. I'd like you just to talk about this painting and the differences we see, that shift that we see. We've touched on it with Annelien, but the development that we've seen in his work since the first breakthrough triptych and this.
Well, the George Dyer triptychs are a very special interlude in his work. They're really a remarkable meditation on death, and they approach death in different ways. This particular triptych that we're looking at here is the most quiet, classical, reserved, and meditational, really, of the ones that he did around Dyer's death. Others are much more bloody and difficult to deal with. This one, though, is very formal and almost quiet. And if you look at the two, but it's also very, very disturbing, because if you look at the two side panels, you'll see that George Dyer is leaking. He's beginning to leak away. So he's, as we all are, always, every day, he's dying in the process of dying, even when he's alive. And this sort of shadow, this kind of leaking shadow that comes from him is painted a vital, organic kind of slightly blood-tinged, flesh-colored tint. So he's still alive despite the classical poses there. But then when you look at the center panel, which is always very important for Bacon, of course, there is the most extraordinary violet. that violet puddle and shadow, which is no longer human in the same way as that fleshy colored puddles on the either side. And nor is the line the same. The line on the right and left is moving in an animated, organic way. Here, the line is strict and it contains a violet puddle, and it's an image of death, but not like any image of death that you've ever seen before. And the blackness, the black backgrounds and the black in the front of the two side panels is so blank, you know, there is nothing there. And the central panel pitches you are in the audience, right? Here we are again with a triptych classical painting, a Greek painting, and the central panel pushes you right into the face of death. You no longer have that edge of black protecting you from the figure on the side panels. In the center, you're right there, and you have to confront the violet. It's not like any other picture.
Wonderful, thank you, Mark. I think this would be a good moment for us to open up. I've got quite a few questions coming in on the Q&A, so I want to just address some of those. Pam asks, at the Bacon Moor exhibition, which was at the Ashmolean in Oxford, I witnessed a woman having a panic attack in front of one of Bacon's paintings. What for you were the main difficulties in bringing the fractured parts of an extensive range of stories, hype and biography to formulate a fair assessment of an artist who only wanted to be judged by the visual consumption of his paintings? Let's start with you, Annelyn, on that.
Well, that plays into what we talked about earlier, Bacon's hiding. He was as much about what he wanted to hide as what he wanted to show. So to that extent, Bacon, both his life, you could talk about the life as a work, and the paintings, each of them is reflective of the sort of disjointed, hidden, going down deep inside something. In a sense, they kind of are, there are bookends. You know, the sensibility comes out if you understand the man, the sort of very shy a person who's had such difficulties with his life, but yet has to command the room. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible tension that is there both in Bacon's life and in his art.
Could I answer that too? A slightly different way. A friend of ours was a graduate student in London many years ago, and she would go sit in front of three studies, that horrific monster Eumenides painting. And unlike the woman that your questioner describes, she was very depressed at the time. She would leave and always felt reassured and happy after she saw the painting. I think because she thought, well, somebody else is also depressed and somebody else also sees the difficulty and the human monster. And so there are people who, when they see the human monster, the animal inside the man, get very upset. And Bacon wanted that. He wanted you to face that. There are others who feel reassured, at least I'm not alone. There are people who see the problem just as I do. So it can go both ways.
I have two questions on a very similar theme. So why did Bacon always show his paintings glazed behind glass? And the follow-up to this question is, was it Marlborough's doing, so Marlborough Fine Artists' gallery doing it, or was it Bacon's own choice? And do they link back to the modernist tables that he created? Are they glazed to reflect us as part of the picture? Annelyn.
Well, the glazing goes back to the very beginning of Bacon's life. Mark had mentioned that the show that he gave, the Transition Gallery show that he created for himself when he couldn't get representation. So that was 1934. And one of the big issues in the back and forth with his cousin and other friends was, oh, I want these to be glazed. I want them in beautiful gilt frames. So part of it was Bacon was very much into presentation. You know, I mean, he was dancing on a stage where he looked to Velázquez and, you know, he looked to Van Gogh and he looked to Rembrandt. And so he wanted that sort of grandeur, you know, and he understood his themes were great and grand themes. So that was all that was sort of baked in. But he also said that he liked to see people looking at the paintings that were, you know, through the glass, because they would also see their reflections. And so he very much wanted that duality going on, so that people were aware of themselves even as they were aware of the paintings.
I mean, the theatrical stage quality juxtaposed with the immediacy of the images, the tension there between the artifice, the glass and the frame, and the reality and the moment in the painting. He liked that tension.
I have another question here. You mentioned briefly his half-finished or destroyed paintings. What value do you see in these being shown in institutions, or do you think they're negatively fetishized? Mark, do you want to take this one?
I think they're negatively fetishized. I'm very much on the side of artists in this. I think if they decide that they don't want their work shown, if it's unfinished, if they've destroyed it, I think it should be protected and retained for scholarship. But no, I don't think it's fair to the artist to show work that he did not release from the studio, unless you do it in a very careful and thoughtful way, emphasizing that this was work that he did not release and that we're looking at it for this or that reason, but that it's not representative of his achievement.
Also, in point of fact, he tried desperately hard to bring claw back, as it were, the works that had escaped, one somewhere from a painter called Nicholas Brusilovsky, who took over his studio in Tangier, and another artist who took over his studio at Cromwell Place. And in each instance, Bacon went to great lengths, including getting counsel in Italy to try to claw back the paintings. He was very impressed with wanting to destroy what he thought inferior.
I have a question here, Jack Harty. Very simple question. How did you feel about him before, during, and after your work? I'm a huge fan of Bacon's art, but I enjoy the idea that he was a difficult and unpleasant character. Mark?
Well, actually, he wasn't difficult and unpleasant. He could be charming. He had wonderful manners, and yes, he could strike like a serpent when he was drunk sometimes. But he was marvelous company, and he told funny stories, and he was great. But I think I like his work better now than I did before I began. I don't know how Anlin feels about it, but it's much more varied than I thought. I always thought that Bacon, both as a man, was this one thing that we have all heard about, but also as a painter was this three studies kind of painter. In fact, he's on the blue side of things, but he's very varied. And so I find his variety, his self-portraits are marvelous in their variety. I find all of that very interesting, and I look to his best work. I sort of ignore his inferior work.
You just mentioned portraiture too. Nobody really talks about Francis Bacon's portraits. I've had difficulty with that word, but he sort of was one of the great 20th century portrait painters. David Sylvester said at one point, David Sylvester was so quotable. In one radio interview, he said, well, you can imagine a Francis Bacon portrait hanging on the wall of the ancestral castle, but sort of moldering away, as opposed to sort of the Gainsboroughs and Reynolds. But isn't that a wonderful idea of Francis Bacon having his place in portraiture as well as all the other things he did?
Interesting you should say portraiture, because Elizabeth Lambert asks, the breakout painting, the one we discussed earlier, the three studies at the base of the crucifixion, makes Elizabeth think of a suggestion of self-portraiture. Whenever she has seen videos of Bacon, she's always been struck by the plasticity of his mouth, very erotic and not unlike the quality of those studies. Mark, what do you make of that?
I think Bacon would be very pleased with that response. I think he wanted people to respond truthfully in the way they actually responded. And yes, I mean, mouths do all kinds of things, don't they? Both useful and sexual, and they're frightening and they're appealing, and they do all kinds of things. And so he would like her response. He would like that she would think that maybe he's sneaking a little bit of himself in there, and that maybe she's sneaking a little bit of herself in there too. And the mouth can contain it all.
The next question comes in two parts, so I'm going to split it up a little bit. The first part I'm going to direct to Annalyn, which is what encouraged you to focus on Bacon as a research project?
That is a very interesting question. So previously we had focused on Willem de Kooning, sort of the immigrant who had a wonderful story of growing up in Holland, impoverished, as a stowaway on a boat, comes to America and becomes internationally famous. So that was a great trajectory and storyline to deal with. Then you're starting to think about other artists with whom you might want to spend a decade, because that's how much we spend. And, there are not that many 20th century painters who have either the stature or intrigue of Francis Bacon. You know, we knew going in that he was a difficult character, that he had done a lot to obfuscate his life. But in a sense, that is catnip. You know, you want to go in there. What you really want to do is spend all that time with somebody who's worthy of it, you know, who has an artistic vision that you admire. As Mark said, we came to, you know, like the paintings more as time went on. But the motivation is that you want somebody who is at the top of the game.
Additionally, I mean, it's interesting to have an artist who represents more than his art. So he represents homosexuality to a degree before gay liberation. So that's a homosexual life. That's interesting. He represents a kind of existential assault on Western institutions. That's interesting. All of this is in the paintings, but it's also apart from the paintings. So he's a symbolic character, an emblematic figure.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I certainly got a feeling of when I was reading this is it was as much a biography of Francis Bacon as it was a sort of history of the 20th century, particularly European history of the 20th century. I mean, his life tracks the 20th century almost exactly.
That's exactly right. And the other final thing to say as biographers, often biographers don't go into giving the milieu, you know, the surround. So today, how many people in the 20 to 30-year-olds would know that much about the Weimar Republic? You know, so part of your responsibility is to bring up your character, but also the world in which your character lived.
There was a second part to that question, which I will direct towards Mark. Which Bacon painting would you like to hang in your home?
Well, that's a rather wicked question, because that's what people always say. Well, I like to look at it in a museum, but I wouldn't hang it in my home. Well, I think since I don't live in a grand way, I don't think I have room for a triptych. But I think a Bacon self-portrait would be something that I would like to hang in the moldering part of our apartment. I think that would be about right.
Annalyn, do you have one?
Yes, indeed. And this is going to sound so weird to everybody, but Head One, which is the snarling creature that began his great series, you know, in 1949. And Head One is sort of this mouth. It's not human. It's a creature, you know, it's a sort of monster creature, and it's looking up and snarling. And I think I'd have to dedicate a whole room to that painting.
And I didn't know you had this aspect to you. This is rather disturbing after all these years to find that you have a Mr. Hyde inside you.
That's right. Never too late to learn. But those paintings to me have never been equaled in terms of their power and the sheer kind of melding of the beast in the human and the human in the beast. You know,
another nice painting to hang that's not a beast painting is the George Dyer one on a bicycle. I don't know if your questioner knows that painting, but it's a charming picture of a sort of classic English guy riding a bicycle, and there's no monster in it. It's just right.
Yeah, perhaps a little bit easier to live with. We're coming to the end of our time. Thank you to those of you watching who have submitted questions. That's been absolutely wonderful. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of them, but nearly there. Annalyn and Mark, thank you very much for having been with us. I think it's particularly fitting that an artist who during his lifetime sought out couples, and I'm thinking here of Dennis Worth Miller, Dicky Chopping, and then later the couples Reinhard Hassett and Eddie Batash, who he spent a lot of time with. It's very fitting that he should have his definitive biography written by a couple themselves. I have one parting question. We'll have to be very quick on it, but I wonder what both of you think Francis Bacon himself would have made of your book. Annalyn.
I think that he would have been initially totally against it. And then hopefully, because he was a marvelous reader, he had an enormous library in his bedsit, I think he might have come to have liked it.
Mark.
I really don't know. I think he would have not liked it because I think we looked a little bit too much behind the mask, but maybe he would have liked to have been seen. You know, I mean, we all want to be finally seen, and Bacon was all about in his art seeing what wasn't being shown. So perhaps he would have said this is wrong and that is wrong, but perhaps the general import of the book he would have supported, but I'm not sure.
I think that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you very much. Anna Lynn Swan and Mark Stevens, thank you very much for your time.